Thanks for joining me and my co-authors. While obviously you won't be able to interrupt me in real time, please reach out with any questions or comments, and we'd love to chat offline. So today what I'm going to talk about is human capital investment in the presence of child labor. And particularly what we're interested in understanding is, do higher ability kids work or stay in school? And what are the consequences of this for later life earnings? And the reason why we think this is an interesting question is the sort of standard view that policymakers and researchers have, and we have a long list of references in the paper, is early life investments lead to higher ability, both in terms of brain and brawn potentially. And children who receive early life investments are then endogenously going to benefit more from going to school when they're adolescents. And so they're endogenously going to choose to go to more school. And so there's going to be this kind of snowball effect driven by what's called dynamic complementarity. That early life investments, which lead to ability, endogenously lead to more school going. And so it's going to be like a big shift in what people's human capital attainment is. But we think that in places where there's a lot of child labor, that's not going to be the only relevant force. And the reason why is higher ability kids may also be better at working. They're not only bigger and stronger, but they might be more trustworthy. And so, for instance, parents might be more willing to let them watch their siblings. And that second force could reduce or even reverse the positive effects of early life investments. And so conceptually, we think these forces are broadly at play everywhere. We're going to study this in the context of India to understand quantitatively, how big these things are. And so empirically, the idea of what we're going to do is we're going to take one plausibly exogenous shock to ability, which is going to be rainfall. So some kids in some cohorts in some places happen to be born in times of plenty. They get access to more food. They turn out to be bigger and stronger and have higher cognitive ability. That's, we contribute to this literature a little bit, but this is a standard kind of finding. And now what we're interested in doing is we're interested in taking the same shock and understanding its heterogeneous effects on school going over space, where the heterogeneity is coming from child labor. So do we see, for instance, that in places with lots of child labor, the relationship between ability and school going is different than in places with no child labor? Where the story we have in mind is, if we see less school going in places with high child labor, that's probably being driven by the opportunity cost of school. And so the first thing that we can do is we can use what turns out to be a lot of spatial variation in India in terms of the share of kids as kids under 18 who report working. So this isn't like a north-south thing. And the second thing that we can do is we can say, look, obviously this is an endogenous object, and some of this is being driven by, for instance, poverty, but not all of it. So Gujarat is relatively wealthy, but also has a fair amount of child labor. And the reason why is probably cotton. Cotton is a crop for which kids are relatively good at picking. And in general in India, it turns out to be the case that places that grow relatively more cotton also have relatively more child labor. And not just cotton, but also pulses, millets, and sugarcane, all of which qualitatively seem like ex-ante crops that we might have predicted would be ones associated with child labor. So the numbers kind of make sense. And so what we can do is we can use the crop mix as an IV for the actual amount of child labor to sort of extract the component that's being driven by demand. Right now, the story we have in mind is higher ability kids are even more relatively higher in demand in the high child labor places. We show that in the paper. And so then we can say that how much does this increase in the opportunity cost affect the choices to go to school? We use a kind of standard difference in difference framework. I'm not even going to lay it out for you because I'm running out of time. So this first column is the standard thing that people find. So early life rain when someone's a baby, when they're a child, so later, not contemporaneously, means that they're less likely to be working. But this mass heterogeneity, as I described. In the low child labor places, it makes kids substantially less likely to be working because the story is they're now the benefit of schooling is higher. But in the high child labor places, the benefit of schooling is higher, but also the opportunity cost is higher. And so that mitigates the effect. And in some, depending on the specification, it's even significant that not only do they not go to more school, but these kids go to less school. This masks some interesting heterogeneity. The youngest children, the total effect, so the sum of these two coefficients, the total effect is basically zero. Very young child, the opportunity cost of working is probably not that big of a deal. And so the total effect is just not that relevant. But both for daughters and for the relatively older sons who are not the oldest son, the total effect is positive. that good early life rain, even if it makes these kids better at school, ultimately leads them going to less school. Whereas for our oldest sons, it leads them going to more school. And we think this is because of the context. In this context, oldest sons are likely to stay with their parents when they're adults. And so the parents who are making this trade-off between potentially lowering consumption today by having the kid go to school instead of work, but raising consumption in the future if there's a positive return to schooling, well, the amount that they care about the positive return to schooling might be highest for the oldest son who's going to stick around relative to the other siblings who may not. And so in the paper, we have a model that lays this out a little bit more formally that generates this exact prediction. And in fact, we do see that this long run trade-off is important, that early life rain on average predicts higher consumption. So this is looking at adults. So higher consumption for the adults who had a positive early life shock, but that's completely mitigated in the high child labor places, which suggests that this trade-off is kind of important. And in fact, the discount factor that we find to rationalize this choice is kind of low. So we suspect it's being driven by some sort of inefficiency, which we describe more in the paper. So take a look if you have a chance, or just send me an email, and of course, we'd be happy to chat more anytime. Thank you, and thank you to the organizers for putting us on.